You're used to struggling, Madison. Nobody looks at you. 2 years in, minimum security won't kill you. We'll pay you when you get out. My father, Christopher, slid the dossier across his desk like he was ordering lunch, not demanding I go to prison. The folder was thick with tax fraud and embezzlement records crimes my sister, Kayla, had committed. Her fiancé's family, the Sterlings, wouldn't tolerate a scandal this large. I didn't scream. I didn't fight back. I picked up the file, letting my hands tremble just enough to make them think I was broken. I need 24 hours to think, I whispered. Have you ever realized your family would set you on fire just to keep their favorite warm? Let me know your story down in the comments. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I didn't drive back to my tiny 400 square foot studio apartment. My hands had stopped shaking the moment the door to Christopher's office closed. This wasn't a family crisis anymore. It was an audit. For 26 years, I had been the spare part, the backup generator they kept in the basement and ignored until the power went out. They thought I was a data entry clerk, filing papers for $18 an hour. They didn't realize that in my real life, I was a senior forensic auditor who hunted hidden assets for corporate litigation. I was a shark, disguised in a beige cardigan, and my parents' ignorance was about to become my greatest weapon. I pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour co-working space I used for freelance consults. The neon sign buzzed overhead like a dying insect. Inside, my laptop glowed with the only truth I've ever been able to trust: numbers. I tethered to my phone's hotspot and bypassed the emotional debris of the evening. I went straight for the Consumer Credit Bureau portal. I wasn't hacking. I was just doing what any responsible adult should do, checking my own credit report. I expected a blank slate, maybe a few student loans or rent history. Instead, I was looking at a financial crime scene. My credit score was in the low 500s. There were 3 credit card accounts I had never applied for, all maxed out with a combined balance of $95,000. But the kill shot was the business loan. A principal amount of $120,000 for Kayla's failed boutique consulting firm taken out 5 years ago, while I was struggling to pay for my own textbooks. My social security number was listed as the guarantor. I clicked on the contact information associated with the accounts, needing to see it in black and white. There it was. The recovery email for every single fraudulent account was christopherwhitford@gmail.com. They hadn't just asked me to take the fall tonight. They had been drowning me for 5 years, so Kayla could keep her head above water. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and now their accounts were empty. I didn't cry. The emotional bond I'd been clinging to simply snapped. I felt lighter. I felt dangerous. By 12:03 a.m., I had already navigated to the Wyoming Secretary of State's website. Wyoming is special because it allows for completely anonymous business entities. I registered a new company, Nemesis Holdings Limited Liability Company. I paid the expedited filing fee with the last of my legitimate savings. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. They wanted me to own their crimes, so I decided I was going to own everything else they had too. My parents were a closed ecosystem of greed, and they had been using my credit score as the fertilizer. By sunrise, I would have the paperwork ready to liquidate their world. They thought Kayla was the flower and I was the dirt. They were about to find out that the dirt owns the ground. While I was sitting in my freezing 400 square foot studio apartment, eating instant noodles and studying for my certification under a blanket to save on heating bills, Kayla was living a life that didn't mathematically exist. I remember scrolling through her Instagram last winter. There was Kayla, tagging herself at a 5-star wellness retreat in Bali. Company research trip, the caption read. I knew for a fact her boutique firm had 0 clients, but my parents liked every photo. My mother, Melissa, commented, "So proud of my visionary." They funded that trip. They funded the European designer bags she flaunted and the luxury lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. They poured every ounce of their financial blood into keeping Kayla inflated, terrified that if they stopped, she would collapse. And me? To Christopher and Melissa, I was just a data entry clerk, a quiet, unambitious disappointment who filed papers for $18 an hour. That was the story I let them believe, because it was safer to be a ghost in a house full of thieves. You have to understand the economy of my family. For 26 years, I was the spare part, the backup generator you keep in the basement and ignore until the power goes out. Christopher and Melissa truly believed that if they gave any support, attention, or love to me, they were stealing it from Kayla. In their twisted worldview, for Kayla to be the star, there had to be a void to contrast her against. I was the void. This is the trap of the normalized scapegoat. They needed someone to be the struggling one so they could feel superior as providers, even while they were robbing me blind. 2 years ago, when the Savannah estate was nearly seized for unpaid taxes, I was the one who quietly wired them $20,000 to save it. I worked 3 jobs and lived in the dark to afford that gift. Christopher took the money without a word of thanks, then criticized the shabbiness of my clothes at Christmas dinner that same year. Sitting in my car, watching the rain wash over the neon sign of the diner, I finally understood it wasn't about love. It was economics. I was the insurance policy they kept in the dark, gathering dust, waiting for the day the star burned out. And that day had finally come. Kayla had stolen, lied, and defrauded the government. The star was falling, so they went to the basement, dusted me off, and told me it was my turn to serve my purpose. They wanted me to step into the fire so she wouldn't get burned. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. They didn't realize that while they were building a house of cards for my sister, I was learning how to blow them down. The phone started buzzing before I even reached the office. Kayla. I let it vibrate against the center console until it went to voicemail. Then it started again. And again. On the 4th attempt, I picked up. I didn't say hello. I just listened to the sound of her heavy, performative breathing. Madison, you're being incredibly selfish, she hissed, her voice sharp with that practiced entitlement she'd spent 23 years perfecting. The Sterlings are hosting a pre-wedding gala in 48 hours. I need a clean record, and you're just sitting there? Do you have any idea what this is doing to my anxiety? I rubbed my eyes. I didn't feel anger. Anger requires a level of emotional investment I no longer possessed. I felt like an auditor looking at a ledger where the numbers simply refused to balance. Your anxiety? I said flatly. That's the priority here? Of course it is, she snapped. This is my life, Madison. My one chance at real security. Dad said you'd handle it. He said you understood your place. I hung up. I didn't wait for her to finish. I didn't have to. I already knew the script. 5 minutes later, my mother, Melissa, joined the fray. She didn't call. She went straight for the jugular of Savannah's social life. Facebook. I saw the notification pop up on my screen. Melissa Whitford had posted a photo of an empty chair at a dinner table. The caption was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. It's heartbreaking when the children you sacrificed everything for forget who raised them. Some people choose their own ego over family loyalty. Praying for a lost soul today. The comments flooded in within seconds. So sorry, Melissa, one of her country club friends wrote. Ingratitude is a heavy burden. Family is everything, another added. Some people just don't get it. They were using the community as a blunt force instrument. It was a digital public shaming designed to make me cave. To them, my life was a currency they were entitled to spend. I refreshed the page and saw a private message from my father, Christopher. It was short, clinical. You have 6 hours to sign the statement for the Sterling's lawyers. If you don't, consider yourself removed from the family tree. No inheritance, no contact. You'll be dead to us. I stared at the glowing blue light of my laptop. I had spent 26 years terrified of those exact words. But as I looked at the financial crime scene still open in another tab, the $95,000 in debt they'd saddled me with the threat felt laughable. They were threatening to fire an employee who had already quit. They were threatening to cut off a daughter they'd already traded for a line of credit. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were only shocked that I'd stopped playing the role of the silent sacrifice. I didn't respond to the post. I didn't reply to the text. I went back to my spreadsheet. I was tracing the $120,000 loan, and I just found where the last $50,000 had gone. It hadn't gone to Kayla's business. It had gone to a private account in my father's name. The star wasn't just burning out. It was being looted by the people who claimed to love it most. And I was the only one who had the receipts. I walked back into the $3,200,000 mansion at 7:55 p.m. sharp. The heavy oak doors of the Savannah estate felt like the jaws of a trap. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't the prey. I was the one holding the bait. The air in my father's study was thick with the scent of expensive bourbon and the acidic tang of my mother's perfume. They were waiting for me, their faces set in expressions of impatient authority. "I'll do it," I said, my voice thin and carefully fragile. I let my shoulders slouch, playing the part of the compliant daughter one last time. Melissa let out a long, theatrical sigh of relief, while Christopher just grunted, already reaching for the Sterling family's settlement papers. But I stepped forward and placed my own folder on the mahogany desk. "But there is a problem," I whispered, widening my eyes to simulate panic. "I spoke to a colleague who handles federal cases. If I plead guilty to the crimes Kayla committed, the investigation won't stop with me. They look for restitution. They trace where the money went." I pointed a trembling finger toward the ornate ceiling. "They know Kayla paid for the landscaping and the kitchen renovations here with that looted business loan. If I go down, the government will seize this house to pay back the investors." The color drained from Christopher's face. To my parents, this house wasn't just a home. It was their identity, their stage, and their fortress. They suffered from the illusion that their status was inherent when it was actually just a costume rented with stolen money. They were terrified because, without this $3 million backdrop, they were just two aging thieves with nothing to show for 20 years of cruelty. "What do we do?" Melissa gasped, her hand flying to her throat. I slid the deed transfer documents toward them. "We protect the asset. This is a transfer to an anonymous holding company in Wyoming, Nemesis Holdings Limited Liability Company. If the house isn't in your name when the audit starts, they can't touch it. I'm listed as the manager because I'm the one taking the fall anyway. It looks like a legitimate asset protection strategy. But I can shield it. Nemesis Holdings, a private investment trust. I've been filing paperwork for will buy out your delinquent mortgage. You need to sign this deed in lieu of foreclosure. Instead of a public seizure, the house will be transferred to Nemesis to settle an internal debt. The Sterlings won't touch it because on paper, you own nothing. It's the only way to keep the equity in the family." I watched their greed battle their suspicion, and greed won in a landslide. They didn't see a threat, because they had spent 26 years convincing themselves I was too weak to be dangerous. They were so focused on their external shell of wealth that they handed me the keys to their entire life without reading a single line of the fine print. Christopher grabbed his gold-plated pen and scrawled his name on the line. Melissa followed, laughing through her fake tears, telling me I was finally being useful. As the notary I had hired stamped the final page and left with her envelope of cash, the tension in the room evaporated into a sickening arrogance. They were already planning Kayla's wedding to the Sterlings, as if the threat had vanished. They believed they had saved their flower by using me as the dirt once again. They had no idea the soil was about to reclaim the garden. The arrogance in that room was thick enough to choke on. Christopher poured a glass of bourbon, the crystal decanter clinking against the glass as he toasted his own genius. Melissa was already on her phone, likely texting the Sterlings that the minor administrative issue with Madison had been resolved. They thought they had successfully buried their dirt to let their flower bloom. I waited until the silence was heavy, then I set my phone face up on the mahogany desk. The recording timer was glowing red, a digital pulse marking the seconds of their confession. "You should have asked what I actually do for a living," I said. My voice was no longer shaking. It was clinical, stripped of the daughterly devotion I'd used as a camouflage. Christopher froze with the glass halfway to his lips. "I am a senior forensic auditor." "I don't type numbers, Dad. I hunt them." I opened my laptop and turned it toward them, displaying the flowchart I'd built in my war room. "This is the audit of Bice Consulting," I continued, my finger tracing the jagged lines of their greed. "You told me you were helping Kayla, but the records show a different story. You didn't just use my name to take out that $120,000 loan. You used my professional seal. You forged my signature as a certified auditor to validate projects that never existed." Christopher let out a dry, rattling laugh. You had that CPA certificate hanging in your old basement bedroom like a dusty participation trophy, Madison? I thought I was doing you a favor. Why does a data entry clerk making $18 an hour need a professional seal? I just borrowed your auditor title to polish your sister's books. I figured you'd be proud that your useless degree finally did something for this family. Christopher's face went from arrogant to ashen in 3 seconds. He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. I didn't stop. And Kayla, you aren't a visionary. You're a decoy. I looked at my sister, whose jaw had dropped. The $250,000 you raised from the Sterling's friends? Dad was skimming off the top of your fraud to pay his own country club dues and secret debts. He was looting your success before the ink on the checks was even dry. The internal ecosystem of their greed had collapsed. Christopher wasn't just a father who favored one child. He was a predator who had fed off both of us. This isn't a family dispute anymore, I told them, my voice sounding like a gavel hitting a block. This is identity theft, bank fraud, and forgery. Each of these counts carries a mandatory minimum sentence. You didn't just give me your crimes to own, you handed me the evidence of your own destruction. Melissa tried to reach for the phone, but her hands were trembling too much. The subscription they had to my life had been canceled, and the bill was finally due in full. I wasn't the insurance policy anymore. I was the auditor, and their accounts were officially bankrupt. Christopher lunged across the desk, his face contorted with a rage that finally matched his true character. I didn't flinch as his hand reached for the phone, still pulsing with the red light of the recording. It is too late, Christopher, I said, the name feeling sharp and unfamiliar in my mouth. The recording is already in the cloud, and my lawyer has the access key. If you touch me, or that device, it triggers an immediate upload to every local news desk in Savannah. He froze, his breath smelling of stale bourbon and the sudden, cold scent of fear. Melissa began to wail, a high, thin sound that echoed off the $3 million walls of a house she no longer owned. You can't do this! We are your parents! We raised you in luxury! I looked at her, then at the ivory-embossed invitation to Kayla's wedding still sitting on the side table, a monument to their delusion. You raised me in a basement, while you used my identity to fund a lifestyle you couldn't afford, I replied. You weren't parents. You were the administrators of a trust you looted, and I was just the line of credit that never said no. I reached into my bag and pulled out the heavy manila folder I had spent all night preparing in my war room. It wasn't the settlement papers the Sterling family's lawyers were expecting. It was a formal eviction notice, stamped and dated. I slid it across the mahogany desk, right over the spot where Christopher had spilled his drink. You signed the quitclaim deed, I said, my voice dropping to a clinical whisper that cut through Melissa's crying. 100% of the property rights for this estate have been transferred to Nemesis Holdings Limited Liability Company for the sum of $10. Christopher's eyes scanned the paper, searching for a loophole that didn't exist. I own Nemesis Holdings, I continued, savoring the moment the realization hit his eyes. And as the sole managing member, I am giving you exactly 7 days to vacate my property. If you aren't out by then, building security will be here to escort you to the curb. The arrogant silence of the room was broken only by the sound of Christopher collapsing back into his leather chair, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He looked diminished, a small, hollow man in an expensive suit that didn't belong to him anymore. Kayla finally found her voice, though it cracked with the realization that her gilded cage had just dissolved. What about my wedding? The Sterlings. The deposit for the vineyard. The Sterlings already know everything, I said, turning to face her. I sent the full audit results and the recording of your confessions to their family office 10 minutes before I walked through these doors. The engagement wasn't just in jeopardy, it was terminated. People like the Sterlings don't marry into families that are being audited by the federal government. Melissa looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading, the same eyes that had looked at me with such contempt just minutes ago. Madison, please, think of the family legacy. You can't leave your own flesh and blood with nothing. I shouldered my bag, the weight of my camera and my evidence feeling like a shield of absolute truth. You told me earlier that Kayla was the flower and I was the dirt, I said, walking toward the office door. You said my only purpose was to bury myself so she could bloom. I paused with my hand on the heavy brass handle, feeling the cool metal against my palm. You just forgot one thing about the economy of this family. Dirt owns the ground. I turned back one last time, my expression frozen in a different kind of sunrise. And now, so do I. I closed the door on the sound of their world falling apart. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a completed balance sheet. I sit on the white-painted balcony of the Savannah estate, watching the sun drag itself over the horizon. The Spanish moss hung from the ancient oak trees like silver lace, dripping with the morning dew. This view alone was worth $3,200,000, but to me, it represented something far more valuable. Quiet. The house was silent for the first time in my life. No slamming doors, no performative wailing from Melissa, no gruff, entitled demands from Christopher. Just the sound of the wind through the pines and the distant call of a marsh bird. I opened my laptop. I didn't navigate to the credit bureau or the Wyoming registry this time. I opened a local drive folder titled Debt and Duty. I looked at the primary spreadsheet that had governed my life for 4 long years. I stared at the columns of numbers, the $2,000 monthly transfers, the $95,000 in fraudulent credit card debt, and the $120,000 business loan I'd been tricked into guaranteeing. I saw the $20,000 I'd wired to save this very house when Christopher was too proud to admit he'd spent the tax money on Kayla's lifestyle. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, and my returns had been nothing but red ink. I highlighted every cell, every row of unrequited loyalty, and I hit delete. The digital trash bin emptied with a soft clicking sound. It was the sound of a contract being shredded. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and now the account was closed in full. I didn't feel the sharp, jagged triumph I'd expected when I first drafted the eviction notice. Instead, I felt a profound sense of equilibrium. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a completed balance sheet. The audit was over, and the numbers finally balanced. I had already coordinated with my legal team to use the equity reclaimed from my father's hidden accounts to establish the Visible Legacy Fund. It wasn't a fund for the elite. It was a sanctuary for the ghosts, the auditors, the data entry clerks, and the spares who were tired of being used as fuel to keep their families warm. We would provide the forensic tools and the legal shields that I had to build for myself in the dark. To those of you listening who are currently sitting in your own version of that 400 square foot studio, eating instant noodles while you fund someone else's designer wardrobe, I see you. I know the weight of the silence when you realize you are a subscription service to your family, not a daughter or a son. I know the way they treat your hard work as their birthright. But here is the audit result you need to hear. Your worth is not a slice of pie for them to hand out. You are not a void meant to make someone else look like a star. You are the architect of your own ground, and you don't need a single signature from them to build an empire on it. The latest reports say Christopher is living in a single wide trailer on the outskirts of the county. Melissa is applying for administrative work she once called beneath her. Kayla's wedding to the Sterlings is a ghost, and her reputation in Savannah is as black as the ink on my audit. They are the footnotes of a story that I have finished writing. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I closed the lid, stood up, and walked into my house. If you see yourself in Madison's story, remember you aren't a spare part, you are the architect. Share this if you believe in true justice.